Teresa. Hi everyone. I'm just going to first say a little bit about the kind of background why, or how the terms and conditions sort of came into being, and a little bit about what's happened so far, and then introduce the talk and the speaker. So when Teresa approached me to respond to a project that she's doing, it's a 3-year project on art and economies. She was interested in the work I've been doing around migrant workers, or the history of the women migrant workers in the sort of around the period of 70s in West Germany, and a kind of interest around labour and gender and kind of working conditions. And I felt that this was a really good opportunity to talk about contemporary issues around labour and migration, because through that project I sort of discovered a lot about the way economy and migration intersect, and the way that the kind of the way the capital actually governs, or the way it sort of moves the people around. So it's not like, I remember the quote from Saskia Sassen where he talks about migration not being an out of control kind of movement, but something that's kind of deeply controlled by the capitalist forces and the need of profit. So I sort of felt that this would be really interesting to open up a bit more. But I also thought about how how do we structurally think about art spaces and educational spaces and spaces of interaction, public spaces, and how do we think about art and politics together? And I got very involved with the anti-cuts movements, and I felt very passionate about direct action, and I still do. And these are all the kind of thoughts around how to really, as an artist, as a practitioner, and as someone who cares about these issues, how to kind of activate or use moments and opportunities to activate public spaces to create a public debate, but also possibilities of interaction and some solidarities as well that could go beyond the space into the future. So that's kind of a little bit about my own sort of thinking around it. We've devised about, I think it's 5 or 6 sessions, now I'm losing count. This is our 4th one. And they're all very different. So the first one was more of a talk and a workshop. The second was a film screening by at Iniva, which is a feminist film collective. And then the third was also a talk and a discussion around immigration and protest, and the politics and aesthetics of protest. That was last Saturday, and this brings me on to today's event, which is a talk by Professor Amin, who I'm very pleased to say is here and accepted my invitation, and Teresa's. And how I came across Amin's work is that I read a bit on OpenDemocracy website, quite a bit, and then there was a series that Professor Amin, am I pronouncing it? Amin, thank you, edited, which was on the Uses of Xenophobia, and I was really struck by that series. I was struck by, and this was in May, and I was struck by it because I did feel that it resonated because of the economic crisis, and then there's a sort of tendency to go into populism and xenophobia historically, and it feels like we're kind of turning the wheel again. So this series really sort of sparked an interest in looking more into those issues, and we approached Professor Amin to come and speak. So I'm going to just read a biography. I don't want to preempt your talk. I should just say that his talk is called Xenophobia, a European problem with a European solution, with a question mark. And I'm just going to read a short biography. Amin's research and publications have dealt with regional development and socio-economic inequalities in Europe, the social economy of the city, and the socio-political evolution of multicultural and multi-ethnic societies within the European Union. A founder member of the Forum of Concerned Citizens of Europe, Living in Diversity, Ash writes about the dislocations of the unequal society. His next books include The Fright of Social Ties, which examines the political economy of the response to strangers in the West, with Nigel Thrift, Political Openings, an essay on left futures, which argues that without recovering a world-making capability, one that taps deep into unrepresented injuries and desires, the left will never return as a mass political force, which I look forward to reading. So in May this year, as I mentioned, Amin was a guest editor for OpenDemocracy, a series of essays on the uses of xenophobia, through which him and his colleagues explored political uses of xenophobia and mapped the new relevance of an open and shared commons to a continent that is once again meeting economic, political and cultural insecurity with the resurgence of aggressive political demagoguery. I can't pronounce that word. In his key talk for Terms and Conditions, Amin will take us through the series, expand on its key arguments, and expand on the relationship of current economic crisis to the rise of xenophobic ideas and rhetoric across Europe.
I'm going to start off with kind of a health warning, really. This talk is a political talk. I think partly because of your invitation and the venue we're in. And I wasn't going to start off in this way, but because there are two individuals here whose scholarship is kind of so profound and so wonderful, I felt that I don't want to disappoint them by doing an academic talk. So Sarah, both Sarah and Sarah, this is a political talk, so take it as that. Okay, and I want to start off with a statement, which is actually a truism, but I guess it needs to be repeated, probably not in this forum, but in British and European public life. And then what I want to do is to just kind of unpack this statement and then talk about alternatives. So, my opener is this. I think this is really a truism. We seem to be living through an extraordinarily dark period in the history of Europe once again. As a new kind of political demagoguery spreads across the continent, north and south and east and west. It comes in all sorts of different sizes and shapes and forms and injuries, but it is one that targets increasingly minorities, immigrants, and actually democracy itself. So, as economic insecurity dips in more and more because of the current financial crisis, along with, because of economic insecurity and also independently, a dismantling of the European welfare state, plus so many of the cultural uncertainties that go with living in a globalized world, national majorities, and interestingly also settled national immigrant minorities, it seems to me that now, and particularly backed by mainstream politicians on both the left and the right, are turning to the asylum seeker, the Roma, the vicariously defined Muslim, the inverted commas, the ungrateful immigrant, and now we find also to the dissenting youth, as the threat to national community, and as the threat to national community cohesion. And in fact, even entire nations, such as Greece, are being seen as kind of basket cases in and of Europe. You know, so there's this whole process of very easy, almost cavalier dismissal of peoples and nations that's going on, it strikes me, in Europe. But just to return to these subjects, the Roma, the Muslims, the asylum seekers, and so on. These subjects are now, I would say, being targeted as almost as boundary objects. The strangers to be kept out or controlled, to be blamed for welfare deficit for majorities, to be blamed for the economic crisis, lack of jobs for majorities, blamed for cultural hybridization. You know, there's an awful lot of cultural nostalgia going on in the new xenophobia. Blamed for the compromise of national values. And of course, in all of this, what Paul Gilroy would call a kind of a nostalgia, loss of a sense of past purity and past harmony, if ever there was that, now lost, now compromised. These boundary objects, I think, increasingly stand on the line, are made to stand on the line between, that is drawn by national publics, between peace and incivility, in need of punitive measures. And in need of punitive measures, and this is a point I'll develop in a minute, in order to preserve the free West from, again, a vicariously defined barbarian outside. And so it's a curiosity that, completely without guilt or any kind of reservation, these subjects are now spoken of as impure subjects, as contaminants of a once pure, homogeneous, coherent, cohesive West, Western Europe. Boundary subjects who actually belong to another place and ought to stay in that other place. And because they can be culturally placed elsewhere, I think much in the way that the 19th century did for colonial subjects, these are boundary objects which are actually worthy of ridicule, discipline, and potential rejection. Interesting, in 1997, which was the first EU year against racism, 1/3 of Europeans, the EU does these periodic surveys every few months and years, 1/3 of Europeans, European majorities, majority populations, describe themselves as, and these were their chosen categories, as quite or very racist. With migrants and immigrants, particularly in the European North, seen as a threat to security. Again, these are chosen categories, not inventions of mine. There's a threat to security, to national heritage, and to liberal rights and freedoms. But paradoxically, in 1997, 3/4 of the majorities interviewed still declared support for multiculturalism. By 2005, 7 years later, 8 years later, and I think particularly because of 9/11 and deepening economic crisis, 65% of this population of Europe, of an expanded EU, admittedly, regretted multiculturalism. 25% wanted now the repatriation of illegal immigrants, whereas that percentage was minute in 1997. And both the European North and European South, and now also the European East, as a result of accession, saw the immigrant, the stranger, the Roma, the asylum seeker, essentially as a threat to everything. Everything cherished to be European. But, and here's the paradox again, 66%, so more or less the same percentage as before, defined Europe as the cradle of peace, social equity, freedom of expression, tolerance, and openness to others. Their words, not mine. So it seems that in the new Europe, xenophobia, on the one hand, and liberalism and social democracy are progressing hand in hand. Europeans, by that I mean different kinds of European publics, politicians and the media in particular feel, therefore, I think, because of this connection between liberalism and xenophobia, feel that it is fair game to make game of the figure of the stranger. There is no guilt anymore. It's okay, you know, to name the barbarian as barbarian. So intolerance is being justified as a way of preserving liberalism. It's being justified as a way of preserving the freedoms of the West. Historically, one gained, fought for, and kept apart from the colonies. The West of common values, the West of individual rights, the West of the civilizing mission, and the West of, and I think this is the most painful one for me, I think, the West of democratic society. So, to rephrase the French philosopher Michel Foucault, what I think is going on now, by rephrase I mean, this is his phrase, he talked about society must be defended by all kinds of means. What's happening now, I think, that the idea of society to be defended is one in which one must declare explicit war on the stranger.